Thanks, Pam. And I hope you can all see and hear me. It's the standard introduction, but I hope you can. Let me know if not. And yeah, no, I'm in Dundee actually, having relocated from Barcelona yesterday. So I'm pleased to be here doing this with you rather than lugging boxes and suitcases around, which has been my life for the last while. So yeah, just to give you a quick introduction. So TALT, I set up with my other co-director, Claire Sevier, about a year and a half ago. And it's really because we were at a point, or I was certainly at a point where I thought I've come from quite an academic research background, then moved into work for a funder for a number of years as the research and evaluation manager for youth music. And then with BOP Consulting, I was working for a lot of other big funders to evaluate music projects and other types of projects. So I think hopefully you'll see the ideas that I'm trying to convey there, but it's very much from that perspective of coming from those different roles and identities in my professional career. And these are some thoughts and recollections of some of those experiences. And yeah, the untangling earphones analogy is really just thinking about who's involved in this research and who's paying for it and whose voices are being represented, who's directing those voices, and who's conveying or interpreting those voices. And quite often that can be practitioners, evaluators, researchers themselves, deciding whose voice is going to be heard, in what format, in what context. And I think there's, generally speaking, and I'm not the only person that thinks this, lots of people have published around it, it's a bit of a mess and it's not always clear who is speaking and who is listening to whom. And just to sort of evidence that in a slightly different way, I mean, this is quite a classic kind of hierarchy in terms of knowledge production, in terms of how evaluation is done. So it tends to be funders who will commission evaluators. And therefore, when we think about where the locus of control is, it's often at the top of this pyramid. So funders are commissioning evaluations because they've got a sense of what kind of questions want to be asked and answered, and directing that process across funded organisations, who in turn then ask practitioners in the workforce to fill out forms, to work with the evaluators and that are being kind of sort of moved, like pushed onto them. And at the very bottom of that, you have the actual participants and public who are doing the actual work and have got things to say and are developing their voice often in projects. But this is, this can be quite a biased process. It raises big questions about the ownership of truth and the ownership of knowledge. So what we think it would be a bit more of a better way of thinking about it is something a bit more cellular. So thinking about knowledge being produced and reproduced in the process of an intervention or a project or a program. And the evaluator's role in this context is really about accessing knowledge, creating a critical and reflective space for these different actors and stakeholders to come together and discuss what's actually happening. So it's not about privileging particular questions or methods. It's about recognizing your role as an evaluator to come up with methods and questions and data gathering processes and reporting processes that really highlight the learning that's emerging from a particular program or intervention, and using that throughout the process to kind of create better projects. So to illustrate sort of how I've come to that part of my journey and our sort of conclusion, and there's some more untangling hopefully that we'll do as we go through, I'm just going to reflect on 3 or 4 projects that I've been involved in the last sort of 15 years or so. The first here is Youth Music Mentors, which was a national programme funded by the New Labour Respect agenda, which was an agenda, a kind of a fund to try and deal with kind of young people who are engaging in antisocial behaviour or problematic behaviour. And it was one of the first projects I did when I worked in the research team at Youth Music. And what we did was we came up with a kind of a quantitative based sort of pre and post intervention sort of style method, which we did a sort of theoretically informed measure around kind of agency, to try and understand if young people are feeling listened to, if they feel that they can make a difference, if they feel that they make good decisions. And there's a lot more detail on the actual method in papers that exist elsewhere. But what was really interesting in terms of reflection was that obviously, as you would potentially hope, the far biggest kind of change between pre and post intervention was that young people felt that they were much, much better at making music when they were given this music mentoring process over a number of months, and that they had much more kind of understanding of where to access more music making opportunities. So the last two bars on the bar chart there. But interestingly, when we were disseminating that research, and we were talking about it with DCMS, with sort of government or Arts Council or other kind of stakeholders, no one was really that interested in the music making measures. They were actually much more interested in this sort of shift in agency, which was less pronounced, but it did exist. And that kind of made me think, this isn't quite right, because what we're missing here is how the actual music making process and how the self-concept of the young people taking part as musicians is actually the driver of these other forms of change, of this kind of change in agency. So the whole thing was fine. It did what it was supposed to do, but it just all felt quite clinical, and it felt a little bit like we were kind of pathologizing young people just through the research process in that example. So sort of reflecting on that, myself and a colleague, Luke Dickens, who I worked with at the time at Youth Music, we wanted to do a bit more of a deep dive on how some of these different kind of outcomes might be related. So we worked on a paper that was ended up being published called Rap, Rhythm and Recognition. And this was with Max Wheeler, who you'll see in the sort of middle picture there. And this is in Hangleton and Knowle, which is just kind of quite near Brighton in the southeast of England. And this wasn't a sort of Youth Music Mentors project specifically, but it had, I think some of the young people had been involved in that programme as well. But the thing that we tried to do there, over a period of about 6 months, we did several visits to Max and the young people, and really tried to centralise kind of what is the music that's being made, how is the music being made, what's Max's process, which is very sophisticated, and he's spoken a lot about this over the years as well, but it's as many other practitioners obviously as well, but it's trying to bring that process of what is the process that the young people are going through, and then what is the music that they're actually making, what are they saying about the lyrics, what are they saying about the decisions that they've made to use certain lyrics or to use certain beats, to put together the production in a particular way. You know, asking young people to talk about that process as well as the content and what that represents felt like a much more holistic way to understand how that kind of self-concept as a musician was leading into the development of broader outcomes, if you want to talk about it in those terms. The other thing, the significant thing about this project was that this very much focused on the space in which it was happening. So that middle picture there is Max in the community centre, where they had to turn it into a recording studio once or twice a week, but that was the space that they were working with. So it's not a case, it's not a case of when a funder sees a hip hop project that's having really positive outcomes with a group of young people, they don't always understand necessarily where that's happening, how it's happening, and what it's producing. So we made sure that all the outputs from this particular project had direct examples of the music. You could, there was a link that you could access the CD, get a copy of the CD if you wanted. We had pictures of the process and we had pictures of the spaces to show funders, to show other academics and so on, what this work looks and sounds like and how that's linked to the outcomes that we're talking about. The next example was when I was with Bok Consulting, and I did some work there with Creative Scotland. That was on a programme called Cashback for Creativity. And the main point that I was wanting to make about this is it's really interesting that the Scottish Government were funding it. It was funded from the Justice Department, it still is, from the Scottish Government, through, and it's sort of managed, the evaluations managed through a kind of arm's length organisation called Inspiring Scotland. And they were only really interested in sort of monitoring and quantitative indicators around crime prevention and crime reduction. They were the bottom line that people were interested in. Whereas the Cashback for Creativity programme was working with, around 40 or more kind of organisations across Scotland, many of them doing music, some very significant music projects within that, others doing different forms of art forms. And what we felt, both we at BOP and Creative Scotland, we felt that we are really losing this kind of sense of like, how do the young people make sense of their own individual journeys within this work? And how do we go beyond just boiling it down to kind of quite bare statistics around crime prevention and reduction? So we thought we would ask the young people themselves. So we went and did a specific focus on 7 projects and about 40 young people and asked them to kind of define the outcomes that were set by the Scottish Government in their own words. And what they came up with was something much closer to this, which is to say there are a huge number of different things. This is just a few of them, but there's a huge number of different things at play in music projects and creative projects, and it's dynamic. And going back to that kind of cellular example earlier, it's dynamic. They're produced and reproduced in different ways in different contexts. And unfortunately, funders and government departments and civil servants don't always like the word complexity, but it's the reality that we exist in. So it's really important to think about the nature of the practice, the type of art form, the different levels of complexity of the practice that are kind of taking place. And indeed, the place in which the work is taking place is super significant as well. And place is significant because of, as that Max slide, as the sort of Max and the community centre slide shows, it's about kind of having a clear sense of what is possible in different places and spaces, but it's also about the identity that these places, that the people in these places and spaces have. So that's directly related to the extent of self-efficacy or self-concept that children and young people can have, which is totally related to competence in a particular musical form. And that folds right back on itself. So as young people get better in certain things, they also feel better about themselves and they feel that their identity is changing. So I guess, again, it's not to try and kind of shy away from the complexity, it's to try and kind of communicate that complexity in ways that hopefully bring people along. I realise I'm talking very fast, so I apologise. It's just out of nervousness and trying to get through the slides I intended to in the time available, so apologies. The slides will be available if anyone needs more detail. Anyway, just to say the last example is that some current work that I'm doing with Eden Court Theatre in Inverness, where I'm trying to reflect on and bring together some of the learning from all of these different project experiences in recent years. And what we've done there is we've come up with a sort of mixed method approach to the evaluation. So this is young people many of whom are excluded from mainstream education, some are kind of from care backgrounds, others neurodiverse and in and out of different types of mainstream education and so on. And what we've tried to do with this project is reflect on some of the learning from that I've just kind of summarised from these other projects and say, yes, you can have some surveys, but make the surveys relevant to the work that's taking place. So the surveys that we've designed reflect that kind of cellular slide from the last slide that I showed, but it's trying to talk about it and apply the language in ways that make sense to young people who are making music and doing creative activities. So we don't use words like self-efficacy or competence, but we do try and kind of get at those dynamic dimensions using language that's generated from the way that young people themselves talk about their development in these contexts. And I think I can't overstate the sort of significance of thinking about young people as artists first and foremost, not as target groups, not as kind of problematic target groups, but the way the funding structure might sort of identify them. And the significance of place and environment, we do some experience mapping with these young people quite regularly, looking at what they think about how they see the spaces that they live in and learning and how that affects their identities as musicians and creative young people. And also working regularly with practitioners to try and communicate the status and the complexity of their practice. My last slide is really just trying to get across kind of how do we untangle, what are the kind of factors we need to consider to untangle those earphones. And I think this is thinking about it from an evaluator's perspective, but I mean, I'm sure this applies to practitioners and funders themselves as well. A key thing to say is that challenge funders, having worked with many funders over the years, they are quite open-minded and they are open to being challenged. And it's almost like the system in which the funding exists doesn't create space for a critical and reflective space, but funders themselves are up for it often. Focus on young people as musicians first, as I just said, I think should never lose track of that as your kind of starting point. Be reflexive about your own voice and privilege as an evaluator. Think about how and talk about how the way that you're making these decisions about what questions to ask and how to ask them will privilege your own voice. Make all methods as accessible as possible to the participants taking place, but also to practitioners, also to the executive team of organisations and people that you're working with. Help bring them into the process and also just try and make it more fun and engaging wherever you can. And also remember that outcomes are messy, they're overlapping, they're chronologically related. It's not as simple as kind of some of the funding forms and things make you see. So it's our responsibility as evaluators to play that back and make that point. And wherever possible, bring these power levels together. So try and create opportunities to discuss the work, to share the work, to disseminate the work, to do the work when you've got funders and executives and practitioners and young people and musicians and whoever all in the room together. Try and create those opportunities, because that's where people do actually see the different kind of levels of evaluate of sort of power within the evaluation that exists. And that's all I had to say. And thank you very much for listening, and keep in touch.